And now I would just like to welcome Cortland Dahl, Tergar's Executive Director and Senior Instructor, to kick off today's event. Hi, Court.
Thank you so much, Beth. It is great to be with you all. Thank you so much for taking time out of your weekend to spend a little bit of time with us. I am incredibly excited and honored to share 90 minutes with our guest, Dr. Judd Brewer. He's an old friend and colleague. I've been looking forward to this, and I think as a community, we have been looking forward to this for quite a while. So I'll just introduce Judd. We could probably spend an hour just talking about Judd and his background, but so we can get to the conversation, I'll just highlight some of the most exceptional things about Judd, his work, his career. So he is truly one of the world's leading thinkers and scientists on the topic of how we can train our minds and even rewire our brains to flourish. So in particular, he's an expert on the science and practice of transforming things like addiction, craving, anxiety, and a whole range of topics related to mental health. And as we'll see, he's really a true bridge between East and West, between the ancient wisdom of the world's meditative traditions and cutting edge science. So we're going to hear a lot about that. He has an MD, he has a PhD, which basically just means he is both incredibly hardworking and incredibly smart. And he is also currently an associate professor at Brown University, where he leads the Mindfulness Center. And as we'll hear, he's really one of the leaders in the scientific research on mindfulness and other forms of meditation. He's also a New York Times best-selling author. His most recent book is Unwinding Anxiety. He has a whole bunch of books, which are all fantastic. He also has one of the most widely viewed TED Talks on the internet. I think his TED Talk has more than 20 million views, believe it or not. So he's reaching a lot of people through his work. And what we're going to talk about today, what we'll geek out about a little bit, is also his own meditation practice and how Buddhist psychology, these ancient teachings from the Abhidharma tradition, have shaped his own life, practice, and research. So welcome, Judd. It's an honor to have you with us today. Thank you
Thanks for
so much
having
for
me.
taking time out of your Saturday morning. So if it's okay, I just want to go dive straight into the deep end. And I thought we could start with a very real human experience that I myself had just this morning. I won't bore you or anybody listening with my middle-aged health problems, but suffice it to say, I can no longer indulge my love of coffee and caffeine like I once did, and my health is basically telling me I need to tamp down on my coffee drinking habit. And it's been so humbling. Just this morning, I understand intellectually that it's no longer probably good for my health to be drinking coffee as I once did. I know the benefits. I've been meditating for 30 years. I have a lot of tools in my toolbox. And still, it's just hard when you have that impulse to do something you've done for a very long time, especially when you really like it and it brings you some pleasure. It's so hard to let go of these habits. And this is an area you obviously have deep, deep expertise in, both at a personal level, a scientific level, as a meditator. Maybe we could just start there. We all have some version of that experience, whether it's full-on addiction or just wanting to let go of bad habits and build healthy ones. How do you think about this with your scientific research, your life as a meditator? How has that shaped how you think about these moments of craving and attachment and addiction, and how we can work with these difficult things in life?
Yeah, great question. And I would say I think it starts with this, I don't know what the right word is, but I would say a hubris, where where we think that thinking is going to solve all of our problems. And what the neuroscience shows is that we can't think our way out of a paper bag.
Mm.
I mean, I'm sure we could find our way out of a maze, but that's not actually through thinking. We can't
Right.
we can't be put in a maze and then think our way into. We have to explore that maze to find the end. And that actually speaks to what I have, I think that the Buddhist psychology really gives a very clear path, and also highlights the importance of not getting caught up in, let's call it ego or self. And, I think a simple way to put that is that, well, let's take it from a neuroscience standpoint. The thinking part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, the planning and cognitive control part of our brain, is the youngest and the weakest from an evolutionary perspective. Mm-hmm. So at best, and it's not to say that it's not helpful. Clearly it's helpful. It was, given a lot of real estate from an evolutionary perspective, and it helps us think and plan for the future. Yet when we rely on it to change habits, just assuming that that's going to work, we run into all sorts of problems. And I learned this in medical school, in residency, use these cognitive approaches to change habits or addictions. And the not so secret result is that it doesn't work very well. People that want to quit smoking, it's like 5% of people have stayed quitted a year using the gold standard treatments. And so it's known that we can't think our way out of a paper bag, yet we keep going back in the bag and looking around to see if we've missed something instead of stepping out of the bag and asking, what have we missed? And so that's one thing, the last 20 years now, that's been a really interesting exploration, is asking, what does neuroscience tell us that the current practices are missing? Also, what do the meditative traditions tell us that neuroscience is missing? And for me, where it gets really exciting is, where do those two meet?
Mm-hmm. And where did you start from the scientific side and then gradually became aware of the more meditative angle and then brought them together? Or did you start a little bit more on the meditative side? Take us back to how those two worlds coincided in your life and how you even came to have this interest.
Yeah, so I'm an expert in something, which is 10,000 hours plus in suffering. Right? And so
we're all Olympians in that particular discipline.
So I don't know where I got the bronze, silver, or gold medal at the point of starting medical school, but I'd just gone through a relationship breakup and was pretty stressed out at the beginning of medical school. And it happened to be that I started meditating then. So I would say, I'd been doing research, loved research in college, thought I was just going to do a PhD, and ended up doing this MD PhD because I really wanted to make sure that it was applicable to helping people. So certainly was interested in science, but hadn't really thought about this problem, like the problem of suffering or habit change or how they're related, for probably 10 years. So I'd been meditating for about 10 years. So I'd gone through my whole training, my MD PhD training, and then was about a couple of years into residency when I decided to take the plunge and start studying this for real. So it was after seeing clinically how my patients were talking the same language as the Buddhist psychology, seeing how modern day treatments were not very effective, especially for addiction, that really cemented my interest in taking that plunge. And I specifically remember somebody in residency telling me that I was going to kill my career by studying this stuff. But it really I felt compelled, and I remember saying to myself, well, I'd rather fail doing something that I'm really passionate about than, succeed, whatever that means in the Western hedonic treadmill way.
Yeah.
And then realize midlife that I'm really suffering.
Well, thank you for making that choice on behalf of humanity, really, because if it weren't for you and others, like obviously we both know and work with Richie Davidson and other scientists who did take a chance before it was a big mainstream thing that is now widely respected, and you can get this stuff published in very mainstream, prestigious scientific journals. But that wasn't the case, when you were getting started. And but if it weren't for your pioneering work and others, I don't think we'd have all the research that we do now. So let me kind of go back to that moment of craving, the impulse that I mentioned. And again, everybody, we all can insert our own version of this, right? I'm talking about something as simple as, needing to change your morning coffee habit, but it could be any number of things, sometimes things that are much, much more difficult than that. What does Buddhist psychology, you as a meditator and practitioner have explored things like Abhidharma, this kind of tradition of mapping the mind and exploring the mind through meditation. Let's maybe first look at it through that lens. What has that taught you about what is actually going on in our own mind? And maybe we can get to the biology as a kind of a next step. But how do you look at that? Like, how do you dissect that moment? And why would you even kind of look at it this way, of trying to understand all the nuance of what's happening in a moment of craving when it's just hard to let go of a bad habit?
Yeah, let's start with the why. And so as a scientist and also as a pragmatist, people are constantly developing new treatments for, you name it. Now, like behavior change, look at just the diet industry and how many people come up with new diets every week. So the way I started looking at this was, what's the half-life of a treatment? Meaning, when does it basically start to decay and nobody uses it anymore? And if you look at, let's say in the psychiatric field, which I'm most familiar, and the behavioral treatments, the psychodynamic psychotherapy has been around in the Western world probably the longest, yet it is not the most prominent one. I was required to do some psychodynamic psychotherapy training in residency, but it wasn't like the foundation of it. And, it used to be like, that's all people had. So that's, it's decaying. If you look at cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the probably most dominant in the West right now, it was, Beck and Ellis came up with it in the 60s. So that's not even that old. It's like 55, 60 years old, something like that. If you look at the Buddhist psychology, okay, 2,500 years. And in the West, we're rediscovering it. It is unchanged. And I'm happy to talk about, all of my scientific experiments. I don't think of these. I just go to the Buddhist psychology. I'm like, okay, what are they saying? Let's test this and see if it, if the Western scientific apparatus can prove or disprove this. And every single experiment that we've done so far has been, well, here it is.
We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Like, people have figured this stuff out.
Right. They nailed it before paper was invented. I don't know exactly when paper was invented, but they nailed it a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
It was an oral tradition that was passed down before it was written down. And so that's interesting from itself. If I'm going to try to minimize the waste of time in terms of trying to understand all the different treatments out there and study one of them, I'm going to study the one that has the most, let's say, the least, that has survived the Darwinian pressure of psychological treatment evolution. Okay. And I'm just remembering, apologies to our translators. I'm going to try to keep my sentences short. So with that in mind, what caught my eye around the Buddhist psychology? And here, let's go back to, there's the canonical teachings are pretty vast. And when I started trying to understand them, pretty confusing, because they were taught for particular populations in a particular time in history. And so the history and the context is really critical for really getting and teaching. And, the people get confused all the time. And they're like, the Buddha said this to this group, and he said this to this group, and they seem like opposing things. If you look at it, he was so skilled at seeing where somebody was kind of going off the road. He would say, and I think Sayadaw U Pandita first said this, he's like, if they're going off to the left, I say, no, come back to the right. And if they're going off to the right, I say, no, go back to the left. And so it can seem confusing when somebody's just when somebody doesn't really understand the core teaching. It can seem confusing if he's teaching this to this group and this to this group. But if you look at it in context, suddenly it's like, boom, he was a genius and says, okay, do this for you, because this is where you're stuck. And for you, you're stuck over here at a different place. So all of that being said, if you go back to the the sutta that turning of the wheel, I think is the translation. The first sutta where he talks about becoming awakened. And correct me if I haven't gotten this right, but I think it's in the first sutta where he talks about it wasn't deep absorptive meditation. It wasn't like playing around in the deva realms or these, the non-material realms. It was sitting his butt down and contemplating, not meditating, but contemplating. And we can talk about how meditation supports this, but noticing what was described as these causal links, what's now described as dependent or codependent origination. And I know that Theravada the most, so I know these are pretty parallel in different traditions, but you can certainly, highlight where it might be different in different traditions. But basically he was saying, that it's when I get caught in, and literally, if the translation that I understand is correct, in this cycle of samsara, like endless wandering, because we feed our cravings. And I want to highlight that because that was really important for me to understand, where one of the links, if you look at craving itself, right? You mentioned craving. Tanha means like this thirst. And then the link, it says when you're thirsty, you do things to alleviate that thirst. And that next link, upadana, I don't know what the right pronunciation is, but upadana often is translated as clinging, which makes sense. Also is translated as sustenance or fuel, which is really interesting because this is where we could actually test this directly. Think of it as a fire, and the Buddha often used fire as an analogy, right? Nirvana meaning like going out of the flame, right? And say not right if I'm not right. I'm not a scholar. So if you add fuel to the fire, it's going to keep burning. And so if you look at it as a cycle, this endless cycle, if you keep adding to that fire, it's going to keep burning. If you stop adding the fuel, that fire eventually goes out. And I'll give a concrete example and then would love to hear your take on this, because this is really where we started. With us, our first smoking study for smoking cessation, we did this radical thing where we didn't tell people to stop smoking. They'd already tried, right? Can't think their way out of a paper bag. None of us can. So I said, well, don't worry about that. Just pay attention as you smoke. Okay. Pay attention as you smoke. And they're like, my doctor told me to. No, I told you to pay attention. You're already going to smoke. I didn't tell you to smoke. You're going to do that.
The order is not to smoke. It's if and when you smoke, pay attention.
I'm not going to write you a prescription. Smoke 20 cigarettes a day. I'm going to write a prescription. Pay attention as you smoke those 20 cigarettes a day. Okay. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But that first study, we found at the end of treatment 1, we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. 5 times the quit rates. Okay, so something was going on there. And mechanistically, when we looked at it, people who had gone through the mindfulness training versus the cognitive training, they were able to have a craving and not act on it. Whereas the other people craving predicted smoking, which is typical. Crave, you smoke, you crave, you smoke. You crave, you learn that it's a feeling, it's a sensation, there are thoughts associated, but you are not that craving. And importantly, going back to this fire analogy, for the people that kept smoking, their craving levels continued. I should say, at the end of treatment, the craving levels were the same. Yet, 2 months later, for the people that had stopped smoking, their craving levels had dropped, whereas the people that kept smoking, their craving levels stayed the same. If you stop adding fuel, right? You stop smoking, you stop adding fuel, eventually that fire burns out. It doesn't just poof, go out on its own. Look at any fire, you let it burn down. And so we're seeing modern day evidence for what the Buddha suggested on the night of his enlightenment. And so, there's probably a ton we can unpack there, but I want to emphasize that because so often people think meditation is it. That's not what the Buddha was suggesting, at least in my interpretation of dependent origination. He was suggesting, know how your mind works. When you know how your mind works, you can work with your mind. Meditation supports being able to see the habit patterns of our minds, but it's not going to make that craving go out.
Yeah. 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 That's so great. I mean, to me, it always feels like one of the first things that starts to happen in meditation is it's almost like it opens up an inner workspace, whereas before it was just filled, you can't even see anything clearly. And suddenly it's like, okay, now there's this space where I can begin to explore, observe, and even if you're not trying to change anything, just the observation itself begins to transform the way it all plays out. It also, I think everything you're sharing captures another important piece of this, which I think is very hard for us, especially in the West, where we're very used to belief systems and kind of thinking about things as belief systems. But the idea of interdependence, for example, does us no good as a belief. I mean, if it's just like, oh yes, I now accept theoretically that this is true, like that doesn't help. I mean, it might even be harmful in some weird way. It certainly isn't very helpful. It's the fact that it might get you to look at your experience and that you see interdependence and you see, oh, I noticed that when this happens, that tends to happen. And then when that happens, and when I pay attention to it, the whole thing kind of shifts and moves and it doesn't play out in the same way. It's the idea only gets you to look and observe, but it's the looking and observing and exploration that triggers it. So
just real quick with that.
Yeah, please.
I love that because I think we can think of this as concepts in the service of wisdom. But there's a mediator that's required for that, which is direct experience.
Yeah.
So if we don't start with the concepts, we might over a million lifetimes bump into, oh, this is dependent, this is where my suffering comes from. If we somebody says, hey, why don't you look over here instead of waiting for us to wander around and find it? That happens much faster, yet we'll be like, oh, I don't even know what that means, right? Until we get into the direct experience that says, this is what this concept is pointing at. And like you're saying, we play around with that. We get the direct experience, boom, wisdom develops. Does that fit with what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's an embodied wisdom. It's an experiential wisdom. It's something that's not like you're smart and you understand all the theories and can impress your friends at a cocktail party by talking about Buddhist philosophy. It's like, no, you actually from the inside, you understand the human condition in your own experience. And then that, of course, changes. So so you said something early on that I want to pick up on. You mentioned self. And a lot of your work, you've done some really interesting work on how the whole self thing happens from a biological neural perspective. But you mentioned it earlier as the self has some kind of role in this whole process of creating habits and undoing habits. Where does that fit into all this? It's huge in Buddhist thought and Buddhist psychology. And obviously now your scientific work has shown some connections there too.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, none of these are my ideas, which is great. So I don't have to be attached to them. But, dependent origination, it goes back to that, where the self is kind of that the birth of a self is, that's when there's a birth of a self, that self can die. And that's where suffering comes in. And it's not, we can think of this literally in the, this lifetime. That's not that pragmatic from a moment-to-moment perspective. So I like to explore it from the moment-to-moment perspective. And I think it fits extremely well. I don't think it's an oversimplification or an overinterpretation of what he's talking about. And the reason that that's helpful is whenever we are identified with anything, right? So I'm a smoker, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a whatever, right? Whenever something comes in conflict with that view, the attachment to that view, there's suffering because we're going to resist it, we're going to fight it, or we're going to feel inferior. There are all sorts of things, all sorts of reactions that come due to that self. So, we can approach this several ways. Let's start with the neuroscience. So, for example, there's a network of brain regions that's literally called the self-referential network, called the default mode network, which is interesting because when it was first described, it was Mark Rakel's group back in the early 2000s, 2001, he published his first paper on this. He called it the default mode network because it's what we default to. He didn't even know what it did, but he accidentally discovered it by giving people an fMRI task, which was simply this: lie still and don't do anything in particular. Okay. So when somebody, and anybody watching, listening can explore this. When you lie still and you're not doing anything in particular, what do you think about? I'll give you a hint. This guy, right? And 10 years later, first experiential sampling study came out showing that about 40% of waking life, we're thinking about ourselves, past, future, even in the present. We're always thinking about ourselves, right? And there's this, you can approach this from a survival standpoint. So we're planning for the future. In order to plan for the future, you have to base that planning on things you've done in the past. Yet we can get stuck in these cycles of perseveration where we're just like thinking and thinking and thinking about ourselves, where it's not actually helping us plan. It's not helping us learn from the past. It's just causing suffering. And so this default, we default to this because it is the foremost habit. It's so habitual that we just assume that is our default operating system, right?
So it's basically in daily life, we're doing all sorts of things. And given any particular task or activity, we're going to activate different brain networks. But the moment whatever task ends, our brain just sort of snaps back into this default mode of operating. And what that means is we're just sort of thinking about ruminating on our life and ourselves. That's basically that's the thing our mind always goes back to. So that's basically all of us, a huge chunk of our lives is just doing that.
Yeah. So that's in the quote unquote normal person. Then you add in things like cravings, right? So when somebody gets caught up in a craving, they also activate this default mode network. And we could go on and on and on. There are tons of, when somebody feels guilty, when somebody lies, when somebody, basically all of these, it was about 10 years ago that we started getting really interested in this and trying to make sense of all these different studies that were showing activation of the default mode network, not just when our mind is wandering, which was one of the first ones to definitively show this, but all these other things as well. And we did some neurophenomenologic studies where we could put people in an fMRI scanner. We could scan their brain activity. We picked one of the hubs of the default mode network called the posterior cingulate cortex. And in real time, we could watch it get activated or deactivated. And then we could ask people, like after a minute, we could say, pay attention to the graph and then tell us what happened here, what happened here, what happened here, what happened here. And we started to get a picture that this reason in particular, the posterior cingulate, gets activated when we get caught up in our experience. So when there's this contracted, closed down, itchy, urgy feel, that's what cravings feel like. That's what anxiety feels like. That's what anticipation feels like when we're thinking about ourselves about to get something, right? So there's that contraction. And interestingly, we also found, in our first study of experienced meditators, that same brain region and that the two hubs of this network get really quiet in experienced meditators. So that was one of our first clues, linking up this self-referential network with these practices, these pragmatic practices that we're saying, hey, be on the lookout for self. Now, conceptually, that can be way too confusing. Like, what the heck is a self? Yeah, we can make this really pragmatic by saying, hey, and Joseph Goldstein says this beautifully. He says, think of it as taking something personally, right? When you take something personally, whether somebody, they're like, oh, look how great you are. Ooh, we get that, ooh, that chest puffing, ooh, or somebody's like, you're terrible. Oh, that ooh and oh, we're leaning in because we want more. We're pushing away because we want less. Guess what? Described in the Buddhist teachings, right? We crave, and this is definitely in the first sutta, where he talks about, when something's pleasant, we want more. When something's unpleasant, we want less. So this very experience, when we want more, when we want less, when we start to identify with those experiences, experiences, this is where self emerges, right? So that's
Yeah. Yeah.
from a pragmatic standpoint, that's how I approach the self, is like, what is somebody, and that's a habit, right? The habit of smoking, the habit of eating chocolate, the habit of TikTok. I don't know if folks saw the breaking news where TikTok just got busted for showing that it only takes 260 videos to addict teenagers to their platform, right?
Oh,
So you can
oh,
so, so you can
nice.
get caught up in stuff pretty quickly, and people can dial it in to get you addicted as quickly as possible to many different things.
So one of the you just I think mentioned this in passing, but one of the pieces of your research that I think is so cool is the real-time neural feedback study where you were showing, I think was it 3 different kinds of meditation? You were comparing different kinds of meditation, right? And deactivation of this posterior cingulate. Am I remembering that right? I haven't looked at that paper for a while, but we've talked about it quite a bit. I might have just butchered your
Oh,
research,
no.
but could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it was really kind of inspiring that like you don't have to have 10,000 hours under your belt to actually work, with experience and even with these brain networks in a very real, tangible way.
Yeah, so that was a series of experiments. The first experiment we did was we had to find a brain region in order to give people feedback from it. And so this is where those 3 different types of meditations come in. So instead of kind of pitting the different meditations against each other and saying, which ones activate these different regions, and implicitly which one's the best,
right?
Right. We're always looking for the best, the fastest, the easiest, the best, whatever.
That's the question we get the most. Like, what's the smallest amount of meditation I can do for it to work? It is funny. That seems to be what everybody wants to know.
Yeah. And I would say, well, right now, look to see what that craving feels like. And there it is. You just did it. Boom. So that's the smallest amount. That moment, look at your experience, look at craving, notice what it feels like, rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
So with this first study, this is with these experienced and novice meditators, we found a commonality across these 3 different meditations. So one is this, I don't want to say classic or standard because there are many different ways to do this, but basically we had people pay attention to the physical sensations of their breath, right? There's some version of that in many, many different traditions. The second one was a standard for Theravada, was a loving kindness meditation. So, there are different types of compassion meditations, but this one was, offering well wishes to oneself and others.
Yeah.
The third one, it was described as choiceless awareness. What is it? Open monitoring is often how Richie talks about it. And I don't know, maybe you all talk about it.
We use the term choiceless awareness. Open awareness is a tad different, but we have practices in the Tergar community that are very similar.
Okay, great. So we were following the Theravadan practices. They describe this as choiceless awareness, meaning whatever you're aware of, just be aware of it.
Yeah, you just, whatever naturally enters the field of awareness, you let it change over time. You're not picking an object and sticking with it.
Right. To make that concrete, whatever comes in the 5 senses, and then add in thinking, right? Because that's often described as the 6th sense door. So we took those 3. We found that the posterior cingulate was the most common region in terms of all 3 of them deactivating that region in experienced meditators relative to novice meditators. And after so we said, okay, that's interesting. The hallmark of science is replication. So as part of a replication study with a larger sample, and we did replicate it, I won't go into that, we said, okay, let's add in another thing afterwards where we give people feedback, like I was mentioning, where we show them their brain activity basically in real time. There's a slight lag because your blood moves more slowly than your neurons fire. And the modality we were using with fMRI, it's slower. We then replicated that with EEG to make sure that you get better time resolution with the EEG. But long story short, when we started giving novice meditators feedback from their own brains, this is folks that they'd come in, they were screened, never had meditation practice before in this lifetime, and they're looking at the graph, and a couple of them, so this is, I don't know, 5%, a very small percentage of people were actually using it as feedback. And I remember a couple, because I fell out of my chair, because I was in there doing all these scans because I was so interested in learning.
Right.
Even with my post, I even told my post, like, look, I'm not going to come to these when I stop learning. I came to every single scan because I kept learning. Yeah, it was like the renaissance of like, wow, this is amazing. Because it was a new tool that somebody had just developed I was at Yale at the time. This guy, Zenius Papadimitrist, and his grad student, Dustin Shinos, had just developed this tool. They'd use these new techniques to do it. And we got to be some of the first to play with those toys. And it was amazing. Yeah. So here, like, for example, there was a novice meditator. The instruction that we were giving them feedback with, just to keep it a simple, focused instruction, was breath awareness. So pay attention to your breath. When your mind wanders, bring it back. And there was a scan where one of the novices, his brain activity got really active. So his posterior cingulate got really active. And we asked him, well, what's going on? I was thinking about paying attention to my breath, Very next scan, these are 3-minute runs. So this is now 9 minutes in. That was his third of 4 feedback sessions. The fourth one, it was like they'd gotten a brain transplant, totally deactivated. And so
we went from like a spike in this network to a total deactivation of this network over the course of just one trial.
Yeah. Not just a spike, but a prolonged spike.
So
like it was like
experientially he started thinking and he kept thinking.
Kept going. Yeah. But he was like, well, I'm thinking about my breath. And that's how they described it. Like, well, it should be deactivating,
Yeah.
And so very next run looked like they had a brain transplant. So what happened? And he said, oh, feeling the physical sensations of breathing instead of thinking.
That's simple. I mean, just.
Yeah. So this isn't to say that, people need neurofeedback as a way to, progress in their meditative practices. What this highlights is we can actually learn from both. If we know what to pay attention to, and we don't need a $1 million fMRI scanner that can give real-time feedback to do this, we can look at our own experience. So we've actually, over the last decade now, asked, how can we simplify? And what we found is the commonality, and we've just actually submitted this for publication, the commonality is when there's craving, when there's anxiety, when there's excitement, when there's self, there's this contraction, right? And that contraction might be help us see this is me versus the rest of the world or the universe or whatever, right? Now we've got a boundary. Now we've got a dualistic framework. Ooh, here I am. Whether it's like somebody just gave me a bunch of likes on Instagram, or which a study did show, posterior cingulate activation with a bunch of likes on Instagram, right? Or here's the chocolate, or here's the whatever, right? So the awareness of just noticing physical sensations totally is a game changer, because awareness is non-localized. It's not contracted. It's just awareness. I'm going to stop there because I've been speaking too much. Go. What do you think about like just awareness piece? Because I'm sure you teach this.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be curious to hear the flip side of this, because we're talking here about what's deactivated and what the thing that begins to shift, in particular, in the Tergar tradition, we oftentimes talk about monkey mind. The mind is just jumping all over the place and, commenting really about itself, mostly, as you're talking about. And there's also this interesting dynamic between thoughts and feelings and emotions. So like they're kind of bouncing off, and, our thoughts trigger feelings, our feelings kind of reinforce the thoughts, and it becomes this little self-reinforcing loop. And what you're showing is that really all forms of meditation, to some degree, they're changing the trajectory of that. In some cases, just dialing it way down. If your attention is suddenly going to your breath or your body or any number of other things, that's naturally going to diminish. One little footnote I want to talk about.
Let's clarify this, because I don't want people to get the wrong idea. So certainly when somebody's concentrated, the background thoughts might diminish or things like that. That's not the point, though. And I'm
actually, I was literally just gonna go. I was just going to say that because there's actually, I could geek out on some studies. I was thinking of Kieran Fox's, some of his meta-analytic work, but in some way, what I was going to bring up, in some ways, the more powerful shift is not necessarily that it goes down, although it might. It's suddenly that it's now happening within the field of awareness, and you're more conscious of it than you were in the previous time. We've used this term experiential fusion, where it's like the feeling of being lost in the current versus the current may still be going. It may slow down, it may not, but you can kind of step outside of it. Mingyur Rinpoche talks about stepping to the side, like finding your way to the side of the river. And then you can watch the current of thoughts and feelings, but you're not just caught in that current, whether it's fast or it's a rapids or it's a slow moving river, whatever it might look like. In a way, that's kind of the more important shift rather than what happens with the current. And I think that's one of the things I'm wondering if does that play out in your research at all? What have you found with that?
Yes. And, just kind of riffing on that a little bit, thoughts go down in a dualistic framework when there's somebody having a lot of thoughts versus fewer thoughts. If there is no ground, right? If there's no up and down, where there's just this wide open field of awareness, there's no relative more or less. There's just experience, and the experience might be a thought. It might be a sensation. It might be this or that. And so when there's grasping, when there's contraction around or pushing away or holding on, suddenly that provides the ground, and then, something to push off of or push against, versus simply resting in that wide open space. And that's, so linking this back to research, I think we can look at this neuroscientifically. We can also look at this experientially. Neuroscientifically, this fits beautifully with, back in the 70s, there was a psychologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, that coined this term flow. And he wrote a book about it. And it confused a lot of people and got a lot of people excited, and still around, in sports, often it's called as, being in the, being in flow, being in the zone, right? And he described this, it's selfless, it's effortless, it's timeless. We lose all of these dualistic frameworks, time, there's got to be somebody in reference to past and future, right? There's got to be somebody self versus elsewhere. So we actually, and I think this is in a TEDx talk that I gave like in 2013. If people actually want to see what this looked like, on flow, they just find it on YouTube. We had in one of our neurofeedback studies, we had an experienced meditator come in, didn't mention the word flow at all. This study was not about flow, but she happened to report getting into flow. And in that scan, you watched her PCC activity just bottom out, literally, and it was, and I think,
so again, this is that part of the brain that's part of the default mode network, specifically with the sort of self-referential part of that, just as a footnote.
Yes. And she described it as something like, and it's in the video if folks want the details, something like being with the breath, as compared to, it was my breath, noticing the breath, like, like me doing something or relating to. It was simply awareness of the breath, and she described it as flow. So from a neuroscientific standpoint, it actually lines up pretty well with our understanding of these self-referential networks, and also our understanding of addiction and craving. Because when we are taking that craving personally because it's uncomfortable, right? This goes back to evolution that says, hey, unpleasant stuff, make it go away. When you make it go away, you learn. And so you repeat that process in the future, which could be as simple as somebody being addicted to cigarettes. They haven't smoked in 2 hours, so their nicotine levels are low. Their body goes into withdrawal and says, this is unpleasant, make this go away. They smoke a cigarette, and it reinforces it, gets them back up to baseline, but they're constantly in deficit to baseline. They're not that's not transcendence. It's far from it. They're stuck in that cycle of smoking, that samsaric smoking cycle.
Yeah.
So we can see experientially when we resist the cravings and we take them personally, or there's someone there to take it personally, that's a problem. So how do we experientially, and so going back to research and even clinical, I remember a patient, I think I wrote about this in The Craving Mind. I had a patient who came, this is when I was working at the VA hospital early in my career. Patient came in with the chief complaint of my head is going to explode if I don't smoke. Okay. Didn't learn that one in medical school. What do I do? So I went back to my old habit, which was go to my whiteboard, right? So like that's where I run to when I'm afraid. So I was like, make this unpleasantness go away. I don't know how to help this patient. And so we're in my office. I went to the whiteboard and I said, describe that craving and also describe its intensity. So it was like tightness, tension, burning, this. And the intensity was going up and up and up and up. And then eventually it peaked and then it started going down. And his eyes got really wide. And I said, what did you just notice? And he said, I always smoke before it peaks. I didn't realize that cravings will go away on their own. So I guess you could think of that as mind blown.
I was going to say, that's when his head really did explode. He's like,
yeah. Never thought of that.
I mean, it's such a good example of something you just taken as reality to the point he probably didn't even think about it. And then suddenly this whole new reality opens up and a whole new realm of possibility opens up.
Yeah. So let's go back to the self. His self had this story of the world that when I have a craving, I have to smoke. That's the only thing that makes the craving go away. And now people are talking about these generative models, right? Story of the self. When you give it enough sensory information that is so contrary to the story, it forces the story to update. Mm-hmm. And so his story was have to smoke if I have a craving. The sensory information says you can have a craving. You don't have to smoke. Your head won't explode. It literally shifted his worldview. And when you shift it enough, like when that shift is strong enough, when the sensory data are strong enough, you can't unsee that.
Yeah.
That's
the difference between like a belief theoretically versus a direct experience, as you were saying earlier. It's like the direct experience shifted something in that.
Yeah. And what doesn't the Buddha talk about that as being unshakable?
Yeah. Like unshakable confidence that kind of comes from that. Yeah.
Because you know from your own experience.
Yeah. The classical example is always, I could tell you that there are no tigers in my neighborhood here in Madison. And you would probably believe that. But if somebody was like, well, do you really know that? Like I could it's not unshakable, right? I could be like, you don't know. You haven't been in your neighbor's house. They could have, but if you literally went house to house through all the forest, everything, looked everywhere. And then you're like, okay, I've literally been everywhere in this property. And I know there are no tigers. That's the unshakable part because you've experienced it versus like somebody told you trust them. It's based on all these other things. And it's like maybe a matter of degree, but you're never going to have that unshakable confidence until you really looked for yourself.
Yep. And that's, going back to that first, that first turning of the wheel when he realized this is the wheel and he saw that
the Buddha
every single time. Yeah, sorry. The Buddha saw this. The court saw this. Every single time it was, it's like, oh, this is what my mind does. This is how to step out. And then, oh, I don't actually have to step in, whatever that looks like. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing.
Unshakable.
So I want to go back to flow. And it's funny you bring this up because my wife and I literally this morning, probably around the time I was contending with my impulse to go make some coffee, we're literally talking about flow and this topic that comes up all the time in exploring, I think in particular awareness, like really getting more in touch with awareness, doing awareness practices, mindfulness practices, etc. And people often will say things like, jogging is my meditation. Being in nature is my meditation. And we were talking about that. And we were talking specifically about flow with and without awareness and how there can be so I think there's like a peak experience of flow. And I'd love to hear if you view, like how you view this, if you view this differently. But there can be I think there's a version of flow where you were kind of where we're absorbed in something. And I would imagine what's going on in the brain is like a deactivation in particular of this part of the default mode network, if not the entire default mode network. There's sort of a de-selfification, to make up a horrible new word, that kind of happens. If you're rock climbing or something, you have to be so focused on what you're doing that just naturally you can't be like ruminating about your day, or you're like literally could fall and hurt yourself, if not die. But even in more ordinary activities, that might happen. But there's also can be a very different thing that happens when you might be doing something intentionally, as you do in meditation. Like there's an intentionality to the mental framing that's happening. Like and here I would say something like in Japan, you have all these traditions like calligraphy, where you're doing the physical activity, but you're also doing consciously and intentionally something with your mind as well. And the training involves both the physical and the mental, versus sometimes the physical one you're focused on. And the mental is kind of more accidental. It just happens spontaneously sometimes. It doesn't happen. It's sort of activity induced versus training induced. So I'm just curious what you think about flow. Is there a subtle distinction, and are there versions of flow with varying degrees of what scientists would call meta awareness, for example, especially like intentionally induced experiences of awareness?
Yes, really good question. And I will preface this by saying, this is my view, my working definition that's kind of informed by the science and also by the Buddhist practices. So people might have different views of flow, and I'd be happy to have conversations with them about these, which is most useful for helping and suffering. So let's start with one of the things that's most confusing. And it's interesting. I have a seminar at Brown in the fall on addiction, and one of the weeks we talk about flow, and invariably Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, people talk about a task, right? And Csikszentmihalyi talked about you find a task, and it's kind of like this Goldilocks. There's a Goldilocks layer in the task, meaning if you take a task that's too easy, it's hard to be in flow. If you take a task that's too hard, it's hard to be in flow. So there's this not too hard, not too soft bed that you get in, and that's your flow bed, so to speak. So what does that actually mean, and how does that line up with the neuroscience? Because he described it, and I think a lot of people experience that, but it's kind of a black box still. It's like, why is this mattress so perfect? I don't know. It's because the label doesn't tell me what's in that, but it's good. So let's open up the mattress and see what it actually is. So if you look at a task that's too easy, what does our mind tend to do when it's habitual? What would you say it does?
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy for you. Your mind can be freed up to think, and it does.
Default mode, right?
Yep.
That's been shown ad nauseum, right? Over and over and over.
If you go for a walk, you don't have to think about walking. And so what do? You probably are thinking. You just start thinking about your day, because you don't have to worry about walking. The task is so simple. You don't need to do it. You don't need to worry about it.
Right. So that makes a lot of sense, and it fits with the neuroscience. And some of the early studies of the default mode network actually found this. When people were doing a boring task versus an engaging task, their default mode network got activated. Okay, let's take the really hard task. So if you take a task that's really hard, what's that feel like? Well, it's frustrating. It's challenging. It's often there's this, it doesn't, the wheels
takes
are
mental
not
effort. You got to focus. You got to, you can't just, phone it in.
So let's split out focus and effort, because we can be focused without effort, and we can be focused effortfully. So let's take the effort piece, because we actually dissected this in some of our neurophenomenologic studies. It's
actually, that's
effort.
a really interesting point. We could talk about that one specifically. That's also an interesting point.
Great. That would be fun to do. And I think hopefully pragmatic. So this is pretty straightforward. There's a contraction when there's effort, right? I'm contracting my muscles when I'm trying to lift that weight, whether it's a mental or physical weight. When something's boring, there's actually a contraction that comes with the restlessness that says, nothing to see here. Let's go think about ourselves, right? And so there's a contraction on both ends of, on both sides of that sweet spot. In the sweet spot, there is no contraction. And this has been shown in fMRI scans of jazz musicians riffing on, doing improvisation. There we go.
Mhm.
Doing improv with these non-ferromagnetic keyboards, in the scanner, their default mode gets really quiet. And so and this also lines up with the experiential quality. So all of this is a preface to say the way I conceptualize flow and also make this very pragmatic is I don't think there are different types. I think there's a continuum and there are different conditions that can support flow.
Mhm.
So one is the classic Csikszentmihalyi, where you find a task that's not too hard, not too easy, and then you've gotten it. And I think there are also hints from, I like to watch some professional, sports players, athletes who really just nail it. Like the Olympics. I still remember there was a snowboarder, Chloe Kim. I think she was 17.
Oh yeah. I
Yeah.
remember watching this.
See, 2018 Olympics half pipe. She crushed it, and
That was amazing. Yeah.
she was having fun, right?
Yeah.
So when we're worried, oh no, I got to win
I
that
have
gold
goosebumps
medal.
just remembering that. I remember watching that and I was just like, wow, somebody who's just at just mastery, like you could just see.
Yeah.
It was so cool.
So there's an example where somebody's got the skills down. They're not worried about themselves. They're just literally in the flow of doing the thing, right? So we can see it there. And when we have that simple framework set up, we can start to test it to see, is this true? Are there boundaries? Are there different types? And we can start to test this with simple things like, well, what makes us feel contracted and what helps us expand, right? So it's more of a continuum where we can be at the far end where we totally lost a sense of self. Or we could be at the near end where we're starting to loosen those boundaries. And one of the things that I've found that helps loosen those boundaries the most is curiosity. I'll give a quick example, and then if it's helpful, we can get into this. So with our anxiety, we had developed this app called Unwinding Anxiety to test to see if we could use these principles to help people change their relationship to anxiety. Long story short, we did a randomized controlled trial in people with generalized anxiety disorder and got a 67% reduction in anxiety versus 14% in the usual clinical care, right? Big difference.
Amazing. Wow.
And we found that people, instead of that, oh no, I feel anxious, right? They're contracting around it. They're taking it personally and they're worrying that it's going to last all day, that it's never going to end, all these things into the future. We help them learn, oh, what does this feel like in my body? Just like, what does a craving feel like when somebody who's trying to quit smoking? It's, oh. And in that moment, they are moving in the direction of flow because they are not taking those sensations, those thoughts personally. They're simply observing them.
Oh, that's amazing. And it's such my gateway into this was actually anxiety as a college student, when I started, and it was exactly that. It was the same painful experience, but now suddenly it was interesting and I was curious and had this new kind of window into it. And it wasn't the anxiety just magically went away on day one, but it completely shifted, the whole experience of it, where suddenly it's like, oh, I feel a sense of confidence now because I see that I can relate to it differently and it's kind of vaguely interesting. And Mingyur Rinpoche often talks about befriending, your kind of inner demons. For me, I feel like befriending is like a few steps down the road. First of it's like, I can just I can stay in the room with this thing, like without like opening the door and running out. But then you're like, okay, I'm just going to sit here for a while. And then you're like, all right, you kind of start talking to it and then you form a relationship and eventually you can be friends and even these things become your teachers. But it opens up a whole realm of possibilities.
Well, and then if you want to go Buddhist on this, it makes a lot of sense. So let's take, for example, the 7 factors of awakening, right? So I learned these as a list. I could never remember lists of things if they didn't make sense. And then in one of the suttas, I think it's the Anapanasati Sutta, this mindfulness of the breath sutta, they're taught in a particular order. And there's a causal element to them. So I don't remember all the Pali terms, but basically the first factor is you basically become aware of something. You can think of this as mindfulness. I think maybe it's even sati. The second factor is Dhammavicaya, which can be translated as interest or curiosity. And in fact, for folks that didn't know, there are actually two types of curiosity in English, in the Western mindset. One is deprivation curiosity, where we're deprived of information and we have that urge to get it. And another is this interest curiosity, where there's this joy of discovery.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that distinction, but it's that resonates. So that's cool.
So think of it as destination. You haven't gotten to the destination. When you get there, that itch has been scratched versus the journey.
Yeah.
Right?
It's more like a child in the forest. They're just endlessly fascinated, not like they need to get something out of that fascination.
Yeah. So it's interesting that this can be translated as interest or curiosity, or put them together, and you've got the Western concept of interest, curiosity. So it's like rubbing two sticks together. You become aware of something, you get interested in it, and suddenly you get the heat of that fire burning. And the third, that leads causally to the third factor, virya, courageous energy. Because when you're interested in something,
this is joyful for Tergar students. This is joyful effort, as Mingyur Rinpoche kind of talks about it.
Yeah. So think of, we're going to have a joyful effort because, man, we're totally interested in learning.
Yeah,
and
it's not like diligence, like you got to force yourself to do that. It's like, no, you're like motivated. You want to do it. You're excited to do it.
Yeah. So I won't go into all of them, but the fourth one is piti, which can be translated as joy or rapture. And so we're enwrapped. It's like reading a good book, right? When you're interested, you're enwrapped. Long story short, step 5 is tranquility. Step 6 is concentration. So we develop concentration, not out of trying to force concentration. It's not about effort. It's about being interested. And then causally, concentration naturally arises because there's a joyful effort.
It just happens because you've basically set in place all the factors that are going to naturally, it just sort of happens at that point.
Yes. Yeah. And then there's equanimity, because we lose a sense of self. When you lose yourself in a book, literally, it's not you, it's just the story. Equanimity. And equanimity is a beautiful example of flow, because there's nothing to push against. I think of it as the image that comes to mind. I don't know if anybody remembers those Bobo dolls, where it's like this plastic blow up doll that has sand in the bottom. And it's usually the size of a small kid, and, the kid punches it and the Bobo doll bends over and then comes back and smacks the kid in the face,
Right.
So think of that as the sense of self. And when that kind of dissolves, that whenever the energy comes, it's not pushing against anybody or anything. That's like equanimity. It's just energy flowing in the universe.
Yeah. Yeah.
So fits beautifully with Csikszentmihalyi's definition of flow. It fits with selflessness. It fits with these non-dual concepts. So suddenly things are pretty simple and pragmatic when we get it down to the contraction versus expansion piece. Just going back, I think back originally to, the idea of how can we look for simple experiential markers that help us not good versus bad, but learn versus learn. So we can learn when we're taking things personally. Oh, instead of going, oh, bad person, I'm a bad judge for taking this personally, I can go, oh, this is what it feels like to take this personally. Here's suffering.
Like, that's interesting. Wow. Look at that.
And even in that, we're already starting to let go and move in the direction of flow. And it's naturally rewarding. So these expanded states feel they're more rewarding than the contracted states. Our brains are wired for awakening in that respect.
Yeah. Yeah. This is so helpful. And to go back to the kind of these endless lists, you find in very classical Buddhist teachings, and it can seem so dry. I mean, it's not, we're used to like picking up a book and reading it like a novel or something. And these are things that are helpful as windows into experience. So you talked about like these factors of awakening. And what you just said, I want to zero in on one point, because it highlights a mistake that I know I made in my own practice. And I think something that's so easy to it's not that it's wrong, but it's maybe just not a very helpful approach. which is we learn these practices about awareness, and we all have the pain and suffering of being caught up in our thoughts, and we want an alternative to that. And then we think, oh, we're going to do this new meditation thing, and that'll help us, whatever, be more, have a calmer mind or whatever we're looking for. But we try to go straight to the focus and concentration, right? And we think it's just going to be sheer effort.
Good old Western mindset.
Yeah, it's like I'm going to effort my way into this calm mind. A very kind of, we would never think about it like this, but it's like I'm going to do being. I'm going to work so hard that I can finally like shift into being. But you can just hear fundamentally that makes no sense. And something that radically shifted my experience. Actually, I remember one of our first conversations when we were sharing a room at the Upaya Institute. We actually talked about this. I remember it. Is just orienting to joy, to happiness. Like when you breathe, rather than viewing it as like you're just efforting to stay focused, just tune into the healing, nourishing energy of the breath, and then you want to pay attention to it, right? It's like this is just your attention just naturally goes there rather than having to just force it in that direction. And that to me was a revelation of like, oh, just like focus on where the mind naturally wants to go. It's like Aikido, where you just use the energy of the experience versus like going out and you're going to fight the experience. I had been fighting my mind, and somebody just told me like, oh, no, just tweak it. Just orient to what feels nourishing and just allow your mind to go there. And it goes into some of those factors of awakening and how they set the stage. And then your mind will just naturally begin to lock in, naturally begin to these things you're trying to force to happen, which probably will at best happen, sporadically, if at all. It just sort of naturally opens up. And it's like coming to it through being and exploration versus through sheer force and effort. But we're just, as you said, I think in the modern world, we're just trained for force. Like we just think it's going to be sheer effort that is going to get us there. But that's again to go to Abhidharma, like it laid it out. Like this is a methodology that for thousands of years has worked for people, as you said earlier. Like we don't have to reinvent the wheel here.
And it might be helpful for you to really clarify what nourishing is, because in the West, and I think it was Sadhu Pandita that I saw him write about this in his book, where he talks about people mistaking excitement for happiness. And so if we don't know what is nourishing or what nourishing feels like, we might mistake the Western, conditioned experiences of excitement and other things for happiness. And that is a huge trap. So say more about what you mean by, what are the markers of nourishing?
Yeah. I mean, wow, this is a whole, and I'm just realizing I need to ask the questions we have like a whole list of questions. So maybe we could shift right after this conversation to some of the amazing questions that are here.
Okay.
But I think I would say this is purely from the Tibetan point of view. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts more from the Theravadan perspective. But I would say there's two elements. There's what we call the view. And in this case, I would say it's really a wholesome perspective. There's a wholesome kind of feeling element to this too, but I think fundamentally the most important is almost the wholesome perspective, which is we realize that there's some part of us that doesn't need to be fixed, right? There's some part of us, it's like the open space of the mind versus all the weather patterns in the mind. Yeah. We orient to just the space itself, which is awareness, of course. So it's just seeing like we don't need to get all the weather patterns just right and try to have, nice sunny days all the time. Like there's going to be hurricanes as we're experiencing here. How do you actually orient to the part of yourself that was never broken, that doesn't need to be fixed? And that I think is the most fundamental part. And then as you attune to that, then the system starts to kind of naturally transform. You don't need to make it transform. It naturally just begins to spontaneously transform. And there's sort of wholesome energies. And this is more of a felt experience. Like you can feel in the body, even as I'm saying this, like there's a muscle memory to it, like wholesome energies in the mind-body system just start to emerge. You're not trying to force them to happen, but it's just like you're just noticing as they happen. but it's the mind naturally, like the thing, like when we talk about focus, it's versus effort. It's like when you attune to the natural unfolding of the energies, this wholesome process of the mind just attuning, orienting, just kind of spontaneously happens. So it's rooted fundamentally in that view, but then there's sort of the more kind of, how do you even, like the conditioned aspect of it, the moving part of it, you kind of just naturally settle into this flow. There's the term flow again. So, but I'd be curious from your perspective with the Theravada, how that aligns with your way of seeing it.
And I'll say this briefly, because I know we're probably over time already. I just learned from a Buddhist scholar the actual translations of dukkha and sukha. And, I'd learned the wheel is askew, stuff like that. And he said, it's actually not that. Ka, and ka is a tough, he said it's a tough word to translate into English, but it's kind of like space, but space isn't the right word. It's kind of like everything. Ka, maybe you as a translator can also help clarify this. But if you focus, ka is the same, dukkha, sukha. So that's not even as important to define as the do, which literally means contracted. So you can think of it as contracted everything or contraction within everything. And the sukha
like
is not
experiential contraction versus experiential opening.
Yeah. Yeah. And importantly, they're not opposites. The sukha is a negation of dukkha.
Oh, just the absence of doing the contraction.
So
interesting.
And the reason I want to point that out is often, people could misinterpret transformation as I need to transform. Whereas if you look at the absence of contraction, it's already there. Yeah. So it's like getting back to what you're talking about. We're already, we've already got it. We're already enlightened, so to speak. We're already awakened. It's just these habit patterns that, like you're pointing out, the sun's already shining. It's these weather patterns that block out the sun. Sun's still there. So we can recognize, and it's not to get rid of the clouds, it's to recognize that we don't have to contract when the clouds are there. Yeah. They're also part of the experience as long as we don't contract around them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so important. Some of the language we've been talking about lately is the shift in mindset from self-improvement to self-exploration and self-discovery. But we're just so used to the improvement. And it's really the mindset of self-improvement is look for the problems, find the problems, fix the problems. Whereas self-exploration and discovery, kind of like you were talking about with curiosity, it's like a whole different mindset. It's not the assumption that the path to whatever awakening is based on fixing and finding the flaws, but discovering the things that are already there. But that's so hard because it's the mindset itself. I had this moment, I joked around on this in another interview I did recently, because I was like a walking cliche one day. I was up at a cabin that it's been in my family for generations, and I had a hammer in my hand. I was fixing something inside, and I just picked it up, and I was walking around the back of our cabin, and literally because I had a hammer, I was seeing all these nails in the cabin that were like coming loose, and I started pounding them in, and there was like thousands of nails. It was like this huge building, right? So, but it was like I suddenly had this moment where I thought, I am a walking cliche right now. I literally am holding a hammer and only seeing nails. There's like literally, I think, like a Japanese phrase saying about that. But this is how we view things. It becomes almost an addiction to see the problems. And then that's all we see. No matter how many you fix, there's just going to be more things to see. Well, let's shift in. I as you can tell, everybody, we could, Judd and I could be here talking all day, but there's some really great questions. So with your permission, I'd love to ask a few of these. There's so many good ones, but let's start with, actually, I'll be very curious to hear if you have any good recommendations here. Could you recommend books that explain the scientific validation of Abhidharma? I don't know if such books exist, actually. Actually, maybe your books actually would be the best. So I'm going to ask you to be utterly selfless here, and because you're probably not going to want to plug your own books, but honestly, if I were to answer this question, actually, it is probably your books. So maybe I need to answer this question, but because honestly, I don't know. I think they are actually, the answer is actually your books. But what do you think? What would you say?
I would say forget books, look at your own experience.
Okay, good answer.
And knowing the concepts can be helpful pointers, but
yeah, maybe to reframe the question, because honestly, and I'm not saying this just to plug your books, but honestly, I think your books are the closest thing to bringing together scientific research and this way of understanding the mind and experience that you find in Abhidharma. That is actually your books. So maybe just share a few, Unwinding Anxiety, the books about craving, like maybe just say a few words about what's going on in those books.
Sure, and not to be cheeky, the reason I said that was that I have many, many bookshelves filled with books. And so we can get in a samsaric cycle of thinking, if I just read this book, then I'll get enlightened. And so, once there's a plateau with the learning, that's important for the concepts. It's important to get into the experience. That's why I say that.
Yeah.
Very briefly, I wrote the Craving Mind first, which gets at, it actually links in some of the dependent origination, et cetera, et cetera. The what's it called? Unwinding Anxiety was the pragmatic guide. Like, here's the stepwise process that we've used scientifically. It's named after, unwinding. It uses anxiety as the thread, kind of the mule to carry the story, but it's about any habitual, any habit. And then the hunger habit just came out, and it's applying this all to eating, because we all have to eat. So it can get really tricky when, we've got, when we're eating, when we're not hungry. So those are the 3 books.
That's awesome. Yeah. And highly recommended. And a simple thing is just, TED Talks. There's lots of stuff that you'll find if you just Google Dr. Judd Brewer, Judd's website. We could maybe.
Yeah, I was going to say my website probably has all of them. It's just very self-referential. drjudd.com, drjud.com.
Yeah. No, it's super helpful. It's super interesting, helpful stuff. So another question is not adding fuel to the fire, the phrase you mentioned earlier, the same as renunciation, or could you nuance that somehow?
I'll say something briefly, and love to hear how you'd answer this. It depends on the intention. So we can try to force renunciation. And I think often, if you look at sila, like ethical conduct, you can see it as a thou shalt not, harm, whatever. Or we could look at it as, what can I learn when I'm a jerk? When I lie, cheat, and steal, or whatever, when I act unethically, how's it feel? And how does it affect my relationships with other people? So I see that as we naturally renounce things when we become disenchanted with them. And so when we see how painful it is to be a jerk, then renunciation comes naturally as a causal effect, because we're no longer enchanted with those behaviors. If we try to take it as a thou shalt not, it's just, we're going to get stuck in our heads. I love
like the force. We're going to force it kind of attitude again.
Yeah. There was somebody asked Abraham Lincoln once what his religion was. And he actually quoted somebody that he had met in a church in Indiana, from what I understand. And he said, when I do bad, I feel bad. When I do good, I feel good. And that's my religion, or something like that.
That's basically Abhidharma. That's just pay attention to your experience, and that's all. That'll teach you all you need to know. Yeah, that's fantastic.
How would you answer that if you'd had anything?
Yeah, I mean, that's very well said. And I think that another element to it is that it's also an opening to a new possibility, as much as like there's the disenchantment, and what powers the sort of the positive view of that is you see that there's a different way. You kind of exactly what you said about Abraham Lincoln. You kind of see the alternative. So there's I'm disenchanted with that because I'm seeing it clearly. I'm seeing that it's creating suffering or creating stress or whatever. And there's a new possibility, which either you've directly experienced or you're opening to the possibility of a new experience. And so there's a simultaneous kind of turning away and turning towards something new, which I think is a very beautiful inner movement. But if it's only the letting go, I think that's where it tends to be, as you're saying, it's just like you're forcing it, or you haven't sensed the new possibility, and then it obviously can be so much harder. So there's another question about grief. The question is, I would appreciate if you could talk a little about grief and its effects on the brain and tips to overcome.
Yeah, it's a great question. Briefly, because I think we could probably spend an hour on this, I would start with looking for resistance to the natural movement of the mind. And what I've seen most commonly is grief feels unpleasant. If somebody hasn't developed skills to work with unpleasantness and they naturally, even habitually react to it by closing down or pushing it away, it can prolong grief. It can not allow us to fully experience this natural process and cause suffering in the process. So if we can learn to open to grief in the same way that we've been talking about all of these things, that can be really helpful as one step, as one modality to help us really fully experience this very human process.
Mm-hmm. This has been amazing, Judd. So maybe we can just, there's a whole long list of questions, but maybe just to wrap things up, not only have you studied this as a researcher, your own decades of meditation practice, but you've worked with so many people, through all of your work with craving, with eating habits, with addiction, with anxiety, and so on. If you had to boil down what you think are just the most helpful, practical things that you found that really make a difference in people's lives from all of these ancient teachings and the research, any kind of just parting thoughts on just advice for things we could bring into our daily lives that really will help us in these moments when we get stuck? Basically, summarize your entire life in 30 seconds, please.
All right. So if I had to get a tattoo on each forearm, what would it be? So I have two arms. I get
that's
two
a good
shots.
That's a good one. That's a
two
good one.
shots on goal. One on this arm, if I'm reading from left to right, it would be explore gratification to its end, right? This is not my words, the Buddha's words, right? It wasn't until I explored gratification to its end that knowledge and vision arose. And that's what we've been talking about all morning, which is until we see that something's painful, we're not going to stop doing it. When we see that it's painful, we become disenchanted and we awaken. It's much easier to let go of that. So
back to the smoking, like just pay attention to not even before you stop, but just explore it deeply, really experience it fully.
And if somebody wants a simpler, if exploring gratification to its end, if you don't have very long
I don't know if that's a forearm. That's like a whole arm, I think.
Okay. So ask the question, what am I getting from this?
Great.
Experientially, not thinking, but feeling. What am I getting from this? You can probably fit that on a forearm, smaller print.
That's a forearm. Yeah, I think.
And then the attitudinal element on the other arm is be curious, right? So it's not trying to understand or force or struggle with what am I getting from this? It's like, oh, what am I getting from this? So that attitudinal quality not only helps this one, but also becomes the new habit.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Judd, not only for being here today. I know this is a weekend for everybody joining in here. We all could be doing many things with our time and energy, and the fact that you chose to spend it with us and all of you are here, hopefully enjoying this conversation. It's really meaningful, but especially just for all the work you're doing in the world, between your books, the apps you've created, the research you've done. You are touching so many lives and really embodying this movement of bringing ancient wisdom fully into the modern world. So just a huge bow of gratitude to you for all of your work and the time and energy you put into this. So hopefully this will be the first of many conversations, and we look forward to staying connected with you in the future.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Judd. And I think Beth is going to come on and say a few words of parting words here.
Thank you so much, Judd and Cortland. That was really fascinating. We were having a side conversation on our team, like maybe this could go longer. It's just so fascinating. So thank you so much for all of that. We really appreciate it. I do have some announcements to make for the Tergar community. So let's get some slides up there and we'll start to talk about that. So first of all, we're excited to share an incredible opportunity with you. There is an upcoming Practicing the Joy of Living retreat with Mingyur Rinpoche. This retreat is at the heart of our Tergar tradition, offering an immersive, experiential approach to deepening your practice. It's a wonderful chance to create a dedicated space for your personal growth while also connecting with a global community of meditators. By participating, you'll not only complete a key part of the Joy of Living program, but also deepen your understanding and experience of meditation beyond just intellectual study. Unique opportunity to truly embody the teachings. During this retreat, you'll learn about the core principles of doing retreat, receive live teachings from Mingyur Rinpoche on awareness, compassion, and wisdom, and get hands-on experience with meditation techniques to recognize your innate awareness, love, and compassion. If you've completed level of Joy of Living level 1 and the practice homework, we warmly invite you to join us for this journey of deeper connection, growth, and self-discovery. You can learn more at events.tergar.org. Next slide, please. If you're brand new to Tergar, the Joy of Living program, or you want to invite a friend to explore meditation, we're excited to share the Meditation for Daily Life workshop with Mingyur Rinpoche, which is a half-day event that'll help you to develop 3 essential skills: being present, being kind, and being curious. Rinpoche's teachings are simple yet transformative, offering practical insights on finding peace and joy in daily life. With live teachings and guided practice sessions, you'll explore how to be fully present, cultivate kindness, and develop wisdom through curiosity. If you're ready to bring more well-being and resilience into your life, join us. We look forward to sharing this journey with you. And again, you can learn more at events.tergar.org. And then finally, in terms of events, coming up is very soon now is the Buddhist Psychology Immersion course, which is part of our 2024 to 2025 lineage transmission. And this immersion course will last 9 months. It'll be actually divided into 2 courses, and we'll dive deep into Mingyur Rinpoche's new text, Stainless Prajna, Stages of Meditation. This meditation manual on the treasury of Abhidharma takes the complex teachings of Abhidharma and brings them into an experiential, practical approach for meditation practice and daily life. If you're interested in exploring these teachings deeply and applying them to your practice, please join us at vajrayana.tergar.org. And then finally, a generous Tergar supporter has offered a special challenge. They will donate $250 to Tergar for each person who starts a new monthly gift or increases their existing one by at least $10 before October 17th. With a goal of 60 new or increased recurring gifts, that means we can receive an additional $15,000. Donating monthly through a convenient automatic payment is important to all that we can accomplish together, and here's why. First of all, sustainable support. Monthly donations provide a reliable foundation for our programs. Second, increased access. Regular gifts help keep our programs accessible to those who otherwise couldn't afford to participate. And long-term planning. Tergar can confidently expand our reach and develop new programs with your ongoing support. We only need about 10 more people to respond to the challenge in order to meet our goal. So if you're able to, please consider starting or increasing a monthly donation and help us unlock an additional $15,000. Your support can open the door to meditation's profound benefits for many more people. You can scan that QR code on the screen or visit tergar.org/donate to help sustain meaningful journeys. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who has been with us for this session today. It's been a wonderful conversation. I learned a lot. I hope that you did too. I'd like to say a special thank you to our team behind the scenes, especially our translators, interpreters who have been working very hard to make sure that these programs are accessible to as many people as possible. So, Cortland, if you have, or Judd, if you have any last comments, now would be the time to pipe up.
Just another note of, just another note of thanks to everybody. And again, Judd, for being here today. We hope to have you again. We are already getting a flood of love coming in through the chat. So thank you all. And yeah, thank you for coming, Judd. And thanks, Beth, for hosting.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate everyone's time and your attention and your questions and your practice. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.